Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Watson Institute. My name is Richard Locke. I'm a professor here at Brown in the Department of Political Science and currently serve as the director of the Institute. And I'm very pleased to introduce our session today and to welcome back 4 distinguished alumni to the Brown campus. Now, Brown has a long tradition of producing outstanding public servants, especially in the field of diplomacy. Later today, Watson is hosting the screening of the film The Diplomat about the life of Richard Holbrooke. And I hope that many of you will be able to attend that film, which will be in Solomon Hall later this, I think it's at 5:15 or 5:30 is when it starts. And now, while Ambassador Holbrooke is an exceptional example of diplomatic service, as we will hear today, he is by no means an exception. Brown boasts 4 secretaries of state, numerous alumni who served in sub-cabinet positions, and many ambassadors to countries abroad. Thomas J. Watson, for whom this building is named and this institute is named, served as ambassador to the Soviet Union under President Jimmy Carter. And at least 8 alumni are currently U.S. ambassadors, and several of them are with us today, along with countless Brown graduates working in parts of the State Department and the U.S. government, advancing American interests both here at home and abroad. This afternoon, we are very pleased to have the opportunity to hear directly from some of our diplomatic illustrious alumni. After sharing their experiences in building their foreign policy careers, a discussion moderated by Watson Ambassador in Residence Richard Boucher and some of our former students will be sitting down with current students to discuss contemporary foreign policy challenges. And there are bios available for all of our speakers today, but let me just say a few words about each of them. So our first speaker to my left is David Gehrenbeck. He is the director of the Stability Operations Division at the State Department's premier educational unit, the Foreign Service Institute. Now, he spent much of his career working on countries of the former Soviet Union, including Georgia, Armenia, and Kyrgyzstan. He's a Rhode Island native, and he received his PhD in Russian literature from Brown in 2000, and in fact worked as an RA for some of our Watson faculty, Sergei Khrushchev and Professor Tom Gleason, who's here with us today as well. Ambassador Rodney Moore is currently the State Department advisor to the president of the U.S. Naval War College. He has served many assignments in Eastern Europe, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, implementing the Dayton Peace Accords, which, by the way, Richard Holbrooke helped negotiate. And he also served as the first ambassador to the newly independent Montenegro and in Serbia, Bulgaria, Macedonia, and Croatia. Ambassador Stephanie Sanders Sullivan is a class of 1980 classics major here at Brown and is the U.S. ambassador to the Republic of Congo. She has extensive experience working in and on African countries, Ghana, Cameroon, Niger, and Burkina Faso, and is also a career member of the Senior Foreign Service class of Minister Counselor. And finally, we have Ambassador Stuart Symington, is the United States Special Representative for the Central African Republic after serving as ambassador to Rwanda from 2008 to 2011. And has served many places. After graduating Brown in 1974, he worked in law for a while and then joined the Foreign Service in 1987 and has served in Spain, Mexico, Ecuador, Niger, and Iraq, as well as the UN mission to the United Nations and on Capitol Hill. So this is just a very, very brief synopsis of the incredible backgrounds of our 4 panelists today. I'm going to turn it over to Ambassador Boucher, who is going to be telling us talk to us a little bit about the structure of the panel and how he's going to moderate the session. But thank you all for being here, and especially thank you to the panelists for being here today as well. Thanks.
Thank you, Rick, and thanks for everything that's going on here at Watson. It makes it such an exciting place for all of us. We're going to focus today on sort of traditional diplomacy and diplomats in foreign service. We all recognize more and more that international affairs whole host of occupations, careers, and specialties, and there's lots of different ways to get involved in the world. But for most of us involved in this career, we think this is just the best way to go. So you can figure that out and make your own decision later. But there are a lot of wonderful ways to be involved in international affairs, and we're glad that everybody else is interested. I'm not going to do much. I'm not qualified to sit up there because I didn't go to Brown. So I'm going to kind of sit back here and listen, but what I'd like to do is just kind of go down the panel and ask each person to give us about 10 minutes on what you learned at Brown that helped you in your career, and what you wish you'd learned at Brown to help you in your career. And I really can't wait for Stephanie to talk about the classes. So, why don't we start with Dr. Gehrenbeck.
Or David. So thank you all for coming. It's great to be here. I always love to come back to the Watson Institute because I worked at the Watson Institute, but also because I grew up in Providence, and so it very much feels like home to me. But I just want to tell you a little bit about my own story and how I ended up joining the Foreign Service, and then just to offer a few thoughts on the general question of the liberal arts education and how it can help you prepare. So I was in high school in the 80s when we had somewhat of a conflicted relationship with the Soviet Union. And in fact, I was in sort of peace groups in high school, and we sometimes met at Brown, and we took advantage of the resources here. Some of the students worked with us to think about some of the issues we were interested in. And so that was my experience as I entered college. And I didn't go to Brown for undergrad. I went to Swarthmore, which is also a pretty good school. And I decided, I don't really know much about Russia. We talked a lot about the Soviet Union, but I don't really know much about that country or its people. So I just started taking Russian. And I just fell in love with the language. I didn't mean to end up majoring in it, but I just fell in love with the language and the literature, so I kept going. I ended up teaching Russian for a while. And then eventually I enrolled in the PhD program here at Brown in Russian literature. And my sort of vague ambition at that point was to teach, because what else do you do with a PhD in Russian literature? But I still had this sort of interest in foreign affairs in the background that hadn't gone away. And so when I got to Brown, I came to visit the Watson, and I was very interested in what was going on here. So I actually signed up to be a research assistant here. And I ended up meeting Mark Garrison, who's here, I think, who is the first director of the Watson. And he told me about the Foreign Service, and that got me very interested. And I ended up getting sort of a paid internship at the embassy in Moscow. And that really got me interested. And so I came back, and I was able to finish, in part because the State Department at the time was not hiring anybody, so I had some extra time. But I did finish. But at that point, I pretty much had made up my mind that I really wanted to be sort of not living my life in the library, but out in the world kind of doing things. And it also helped that there weren't a whole lot of teaching positions available at the time, so that helped me make up my mind. But that sort of background story is also connected with the fact that my focus in my PhD studies was the sort of intersection between literature and history. So I did a literature degree, and my dissertation is very much a close reading of texts, but it's a close reading of the texts of the Decembrists who played a big role in Russian history. And the reason I chose that was because I was interested in knowing if there is some connection, or could there be some connection between what's going on in literature and what's going on in the real world. And I think that is very much connected with my interest in foreign affairs and how I ultimately decided to join the State Department. But as far as specific concrete information that I learned here that has helped me in the State Department, there is at least one thing that I can tell you. And that is that one of my professors here, Professor Levitsky, who I think is still here, he said, when I told him I was thinking about joining the Foreign Service, he said, well, of course, Russian literature, you have to know your Dostoevsky. Always remember the lesson of the underground man, which is that people are not rational. And so when you're trying to analyze foreign policy and the foreign policy of other countries, notably Russia, but not just Russia, remember that all those decisions they're making are not necessarily going to be rational ones. And that seems like a fairly straightforward lesson, but you'd be surprised how many people forget that. And so that is a lesson from literature that I actually directly applied when I entered the Foreign Service. So that's my story. But at the Foreign Service Institute, where I'm working now, we're also thinking in sort of a more general way about how you educate and how you train people who work at the State Department and how you prepare people to be diplomats. And one of the topics that we're sort of sharing right now and discussing is whether diplomacy is a true profession in the sense of a doctor or a lawyer or a CPA or something like that. Is it something that you actually have to reach a certain level of competence and proficiency to be a full-fledged diplomat? And we have a system in place to bring people on board in the State Department that might suggest that it's not. That you don't even have to have a college degree, actually, to join the State Department. You have to pass the written test, so you have to have sort of a broad knowledge of a range of topics. And you have to have some experience in the world, so you have to show that you've learned some things from what you've done in your life. And then you have to pass the oral exam, which is really a performance-based exam. You have to be able to perform these tasks that are given you. So again, you don't actually have to go to college to learn all those things, although I've never met a Foreign Service officer who did not go to college. And in fact, most of them have gone to graduate school. And I was reminded, in talking about this, that one of my friends in undergraduate used to joke that what we're all really majoring in is cocktail party. That's really what we learn in the liberal arts program. How do you talk to people about a whole range of subjects? And that's actually not the worst preparation for diplomacy, because you really do need to be able to talk to a wide range of people about a wide range of topics. And you need to be able to be thoughtful about those topics. So when we're reaching out to other countries and to our contacts, they're first of all going to have a range of issues they want to discuss, but they also want to know that the United States is sending them people that are thoughtful and that have things to say about a range of things. So that sort of cocktail party joke is actually not entirely a joke. But that's good preparation for the Foreign Service, a broad education, liberal arts degree, but it's not sufficient, I would say, to be ultimately a successful diplomat. And I would argue that, in fact, diplomacy is a profession, and we're sort of talking about how you demonstrate that and how you maintain that standard. But there are certain skills, and at the Foreign Service Institute we talk about KSAs, knowledge, skills, and attitudes. There are certain capabilities that you really need to have to be an effective diplomat. And so what those are, that's something we're talking about. There's no consensus on the whole list. One list to look at is the list of dimensions that you are judged on when you take the oral exam for the Foreign Service. Also the topics that are included in the written exam. So those are some baseline knowledge and skills that you need to have. But ultimately, I think that to be a successful diplomat, you have to have that grounding in a broad education. You have to have certain skills, like you have to be able to communicate to people. You have to have interpersonal skills. You have to have cross-cultural skills. You have to be able to negotiate and persuade. But ultimately, to reach that sort of standard of a professional diplomat, you really need to have some experience. And in the State Department, the system that we've evolved is a system of mentorship. So you have to show that you have some of those basic skills by getting through that testing process. But once you're in, that's probably not enough to really go out and be effective. You really need to sort of observe more experienced diplomats, see how they do it, and then start to apply some of those techniques yourself. And so that mentorship is how we really develop our diplomats. And one good idea, if you're interested in this, is to look into an internship, because that internship exposes you to some of those experiences, and you can start to imagine whether you are interested in sort of achieving that range of skills that would enable you to be a diplomat. And then I mentioned knowledge, skills, and attitudes. One attitude in particular that I think is important to remember, and that I think all of us who work in the State Department have, and that is loyalty. And ultimately, of course, loyalty to the United States and to the population of the United States, because that's whom we're serving, but also loyalty to our profession and to diplomacy. We actually have to believe in what we're doing. We have to believe that it's important. We have to believe that it's making a difference. And then we have to believe that it's something that we need to really practice and do well in order to be effective for the United States. So I don't want to take too much time, so I'll stop there, but that's some of my thoughts. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm just meeting David for the first time today. I'm realizing what a lot of shared experiences we have. He mentioned Professor Levitsky. I studied with Professor Levitsky. Taking Russian, as I'm going to mention in a moment, had a big impact on my life and my career. I'm also a native Rhode Islander and so forth. So nice to meet you.
It's a big state.
Yeah, it's a very big state. And I'm embarrassed. I traveled the least far, I'm sure, to get here. But boy, I came all the way clear across the state from Newport. For a Rhode Islander, that is a major undertaking, believe me. It's so wonderful to be back in my old neighborhood. I lived right across the street there in Riston Quad for 3 years. This building obviously didn't exist way back then, but we did have other very important facilities around here. The Silver Truck, which I'm sure is long gone. Silver Truck still around? Nope. I think ECDEC and is probably gone too. Maybe some of my colleagues remember ECDEC, East Campus Dining.
AC/DC.
So yeah, AC/DC, exactly, and so forth. So I got to know this neighborhood very well. And it's great to be in this building, but not because of the building, but because of this institution. When I was at Brown in the mid-'80s, this institution was just starting to take shape. And Mark Garrison's here, and I had a very brief chat with him beforehand. And it's amazing to me to see how far it's come. And every week, I think I get this email with all the events going on, and it is astonishing. The breadth of activities here and the amount of intellectual debate and discussion is truly mind-blowing. And congratulations to all of you who are affiliated with Watson for putting Brown and Providence on the international map. I really think it's wonderful, so hats off to all of you. In terms of the topic for today, migration from College Hill to Foggy Bottom, I'm going to share with you my personal story. Hopefully you'll find some nuggets in there that are of some use or of interest. Some of the same things that David already mentioned, I think, were influences for me. But I started with the Foreign Service just a few months after leaving College Hill. I can say without any doubt that my time here and my experiences here were absolutely instrumental, not only in preparing me for the Foreign Service, but for pushing me in that direction. As a matter of fact, there are three things I want to talk about. And how Brown played a key role for me in guiding me towards the Foreign Service as a career. Second of all, how it helped me get into the Foreign Service, which is not always easy. And third, and perhaps most importantly, how decisions I made within the Foreign Service in my career path were directly impacted by things that happened to me here at Brown and had profound impacts and influences on the way my life evolved, and so forth, both on a professional and a personal level. Let me start off by saying I love my time here at Brown. I miss it, and I'm very grateful to Brown for everything that has happened after Brown in my life. So let me start off with what I first said about how Brown, I think, played a huge role in kind of guiding me towards the Foreign Service. I would be lying to you if I said that I had this very well thought out plan that I wanted to become a Foreign Service officer when I came to college. As a matter of fact, I'm sure that when I loaded up my family station wagon and made the arduous journey about 10 miles up 95 North to come here, I know that I had no idea what a Foreign Service officer was. I doubt I even knew what the State Department was. And yet a few months after I left Brown, I was sitting in a classroom in Roslyn, Virginia, starting the A100 course, which is the Introductory Foreign Service Officer course. It was something that happened during that 5-year period. It's 5 years, not what you think. I did stay here. I did stay on for a master's degree in a 5th year. Something happened which actually kind of guided me in that direction. And here's, when I look back on it, here's what I think it was. And my experiences here were so key. When I got to, probably like a lot of freshmen, I showed up and I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I had some general ideas based upon my experiences in high school and elsewhere. I knew that I liked languages. I had taken French and Spanish, which were the only offerings at East Greenwich High School. And I thought, wow, this is really fun. I enjoyed them, and I'd like to somehow continue that. Second, travel. I was not from a well-traveled family at all. My dad had been in the Navy for a couple of years in the 50s. My mom had been an exchange student in Switzerland in the 50s, but I don't think they ever left the United States after that. And I'd been on just 2 high school-sponsored trips to France. But I loved them, and I caught the bug, and I somehow wanted to find some professional pursuit which would allow me to travel internationally. And third, and this was kind of a somewhat inchoate or amorphous or undefined, vague, the sense of public service. Somehow I wanted to be involved in public service, or in my, I don't think I even knew the phrase public service, but I somehow wanted to contribute to the greater good somehow. At least I had this kind of very general thought of what I want to do. Unlike most of my colleagues at the time, because remember, this was the mid-'80s. If anyone's ever seen the original Wall Street movie, Gordon Gekko, Greed is Good, and most of my friends were making a beeline to Salomon Brothers and Bear Stearns, whatever, done great. Well, maybe not the Bear Stearns guys, but a lot of them have done fantastically well, but that had no interest for me. And then something most important happened just a couple weeks before I came to Brown. I didn't realize at the time what an important influence this was, but my oldest brother, who had never given me a piece of advice in his life, just one day said to me, he said, "Rod, you like languages. Why don't you take Russian?" And amazingly, I never thought of this, because Russian was kind of a hot language at the time, probably like, Mandarin or Arabic or Urdu or Farsi might be now, because, of course, the main prominent feature in the international geopolitical landscape was this rivalry between the U.S. and the Soviet Union. And I was arriving at Brown and at kind of a tough time in that relationship. Brezhnev was still the general secretary of the Communist Party. And then you had these placeholders, and eventually Gorbachev came in to be the leader during my time here. President Reagan was president during my entire time here. During my freshman years, when the Evil Empire speech was made. And so it's a fascinating time. And I thought, oh, maybe this Russian thing is kind of a good idea. And like David, I took Russian 1. I can't remember if that was Levitsky or Driver. I can't remember who taught that. And I was hooked immediately. I said, this is fascinating. This is nothing like French or Spanish. This is going to sound really geeky, by the way, but different alphabet, different verbal system and inflectional system. This was really exotic to me. And I was hooked, and I said, I need to learn more about this country and find out why we're in this rivalry with the Soviet Union and so forth. So that decision to take Russian as a language in my first semester freshman year actually had a lot of lifelong consequences for me. It ultimately led me to stay on and do a master's here in Slavic languages. I decided to go in Russian studies to learn more about the literature and the culture and so forth. Took history courses with Professor Gleason about Russia, and then I thought it made sense to kind of link it together with an IR. Do you still call them concentrations here?
Yes.
Great. All right. So I did a double concentration with IR and Russian studies, and that in turn kind of introduced me to the State Department. Remember, I said I didn't really know what the State Department was, but it was inevitable. If you're doing a degree in Russian studies and IR, you're going to encounter all these towering figures, people like Marshall and Atchison and Rusk and Dulles and all these huge figures from the Cold War history, and then the role of the State Department. And I never really thought about this before. I'm thinking public service, maybe the military, intelligence agencies, I didn't really know what, but this diplomacy thing sounded pretty cool. But being a kid from suburban Rhode Island with absolutely no connections with the U.S. government, I had no idea how you get involved in this. And Brown, to its great credit, one day, of course, we didn't have email or blogs or posts or anything like that. Someone put up a flyer probably on a telephone pole and said, State Department's coming to town, coming to campus, and they're going to have a recruiting session or an information. What do we call them, Mary Beth? What do we call them? Information session. Be politically correct
she's
here.
in town.
She's in town, yes. But I went to this session not knowing anything, and it was great. They told you about the nuts and bolts of joining the Foreign Service, what the lifestyle was like. I still remember one guy, it wasn't me, asked, and what's the pay like? So this was 1985, I think it was, and I still remember the answer. Guy said, there's two Foreign Service officers. One said, after 20 years, you'll be making about $60,000 a year. I thought that sounded great to me. So I'm intrigued by it. This seems like a way, maybe I can combine those three things I was interested in: language, travel, public service, something I want to look into. And then somehow I found out at the Institute, which wasn't yet called the Watson Institute, but there was a Foreign Service officer. Mark told me, I think it was maybe Tom Simons. I apologize, I don't remember who it was, but he was very gracious. I went over and talked to him, and we had a super chat. And it was a wonderful opportunity to talk to a real live Foreign Service officer for an hour, and he told me, the pros and cons. And I left that room thinking, this is what I want to do. This is I mean, it may never happen, but this is what I want to do. Okay, so that's how I think the flexibility and the opportunities at Brown kind of led me in that direction of wanting to pursue a career in the Foreign Service. Next, I said that the second thing is that I think Brown really helped me get into the Foreign Service. Obviously, the coursework here was super, and there's very relaxed curriculum. I don't know if you still have this very liberal curriculum, but I was able to put together a set of courses which not only interested me, but ended up being very helpful in preparing me for the Foreign Service exam. There were a couple of guts in there that Geo 1 and Engine 93E yacht design probably were not featured on the Foreign Service exam. They were great courses nonetheless. I love them. But most of the coursework I did was very relevant to the Foreign Service exam. And I used the rock. There was no internet, of course, as I mentioned, so I used to go over there on Sunday nights and pour through the Washington Post and the New York Times just to find out and read the op-ed pages to find out what was going on in the world. And senior year, I went down to a local high school in Providence, and I took the Foreign Service written exam. And to my enormous surprise, I got a note saying, you passed, and come up to Boston for the oral exam. It was a two-part exam, written and oral. So I trek up to Boston that spring, and at that time, I don't know if they still have it, the worst part of the exam, at least for me, was a multi-part exam, was you're sitting in a room with these two Foreign Service officer examiners, and there were 6 questions. You guys remember this? And they could ask you anything under the sun. I think a couple of them were hypotheticals, maybe a couple of management, and there were always these 2 policy questions. I thought, yeah, and there's no way to prepare for it unless you know everything. So the 2 questions I got were both on Soviet foreign policy. Now, I had just taken a class on Soviet foreign policy. I just read a book called Soviet Foreign Policy. And so I aced those exams. It was complete dumb luck. Thank you, Brown, again. And I passed the exam, and I think, all right, I've written my ticket. I'm going to realize my dream. Well, it turned out not to be quite so straightforward, because even when you pass those exams, they put you on what's called a register or a waiting list. And I called up State Department and said, when do I start? And they said, well, hold on. You're so far down that waiting list, we're never going to get to you. And I'm thinking, oh, boy. Well, at least I'm going to stay on for another year and do the grad program. I'll take the exam again, maybe bump up my position. Same thing, took the written exam, passed it. Same thing, went to Boston for the oral, waiting for my questions about Russia. And I got discuss the evolution of the American labor movement and relevant legislation. And then something about tariff policy. And I'm thinking to myself, man, I should have taken more econ courses at Brown. But I completely bombed them, failed the exam, and then I thought my dream of joining the Foreign Service was in tatters at this point. So I graduated a month later, was miserable, moved down to Washington, was living in a friend's unfinished basement in Alexandria, pounding the pavement, handing out resumes. And then Brown came to the rescue again, because all of a sudden I got this call saying, the department decided they need more Russian speakers in state. And if you're willing to take a telephone exam and you can pass it, we'll move you up that waiting list that I was on. So I did it. I eked out, the guy was being very generous, I eked out the 3 that I needed, and apparently moved me just enough up that a couple weeks later they called and said, join us for the State Department. I leapt at the opportunity, and that got me, and again, it was, thank goodness that Brown had offered me the opportunity to take Russian, which gave me an added advantage. And I promise I'll be very brief in the last thing. The last point I said was the decisions or things that happened to me here had a huge impact on my career within the Foreign Service. So pick up the story where I just left. So fall of 1987, I go down to Virginia. I'm starting the course. I've come in with a degree, a master's degree in Slavic languages. I've done Russian studies, done the language, Soviet foreign policy. And at the end of the introductory course, they have something called Flag Day, where they announce where you've been assigned. And I go up, they call me up the front of the class and they hand me this flag I've never seen before. I knew it didn't have a hammer and sickle on it. And it said, congratulations, Rod, you're going to Haiti. And I actually thought this was really exciting. Anyway, I was willing to go anywhere. So I called my mom and said, Mom, I'm moving to Haiti. Burst into tears, not of joy. But we worked through that, and I ended up having a wonderful time in Haiti. And there's a point to this. It comes back to Brown very quickly. There's a point to this. So I'm in Haiti having a wonderful time, at a windsurfer and so forth. And then about a year after I'm there, I get a call from the Central Personnel people at the State Department. It said, Rod, it says here that you studied Bulgarian at Brown, which I had. Believe it or not, I was like one of 2 people who studied Bulgarian here. And I said, yes. And it said, it also says here that you're the only junior officer in the entire Foreign Service who has some Bulgarian language background. I didn't like where this was going. And they said, and we have an immediate vacancy, must-fill job at our embassy in Sofia, Bulgaria. Now, this was 1989. Bulgaria, probably none of you had ever been to Bulgaria during the Soviet, well, maybe some of you have, but the students, I'm sure none of you had been there. It was tough to compete with, living in the Caribbean. But I thought about it long and hard. I said, well, I joined the Foreign Service to experience a lot. I agreed to go there. And my dumb luck, complete dumb luck, from the time I took the job until the time I arrived in February 1990, the world had changed. The Berlin Wall had come down. The Bulgarians had thrown off their communist dictator. I just happened to be there and working in the political section of the embassy at a time when the first democratic elections were happening, when they were having the first, when they were passing the first democratic constitution. It was part of history. I felt like I was part of history, and it was all due to the fact of this decision that I'd made at Brown to take Bulgaria. And then simultaneously with that, next door, Yugoslavia was falling apart. And all of a sudden, there was a huge demand for, and embassies were springing up, huge demand for people with interest and experience in the Balkans. And yada, yada, yada. I ended up spending the next 25 years working in Eastern Europe, which has been a wonderful time in my life. It's been a very rewarding part of my career. And I can trace that career path directly back to things that happened to me at Brown, for which I'm very grateful to Brown. So I'll stop there.
So I'm one of these accidental Foreign Service officers. When I heard the topic that we were to address today, I thought, I don't think there was really anything that prepared me. I think being a Peace Corps volunteer was much more relevant, more preparation. But I always like to come back to Brown, and it's spring, so why not? So on the long plane ride from Brazzaville, I was putting together my thoughts, and I had way more thoughts about what Brown did to prepare me for being in the Foreign Service and where I am today than I had given it credit for. So first, let me start by saying I really am coming home. Laura Sadovnikov is back there. She and I were classmates in 1980, and her office is actually what used to be my bedroom when this land was occupied by the Beef and Bun, and I had an off-campus apartment looking right at the gate to the quad there. I think Rod already mentioned flexibility as one of the features of his time at Brown. I mean, I came in, frankly, I didn't even meet a U.S. diplomat until after I graduated from Brown. So you guys are way ahead, at least of me. But I came in thinking I was going to study geology. And then I had to take, like, geochem, and it was a little too sciencey for me. And I had taken a wonderful classics course with Bruce Donovan, who ended up being my advisor. I was actually chatting with my friend in the class, and he shushed me, and I thought, oh my God, this is really bad. But we became great friends after that counseling session. So the fact that I was able to switch and not get pigeonholed into a particular area, I think has helped me through my career, helped me. It may be because I was comfortable with ambiguity to begin with, or it helped me become more comfortable living with ambiguity. And the adaptability and the living with ambiguity are key attitudes, if you will, that are important for success in the Foreign Service. And I don't know how much that was related to the new curriculum. It's not so new anymore, I guess. But the way a lot of people mixed and matched their academic careers, which I didn't do per se, but I think in my own Foreign Service career, I've done a bit of new curriculuming, mixing and matching, and coming from an environment where that was okay probably had something to do with that. Louis Pasteur said, chance favors the prepared mind. And looking back, Brown really did a lot to prepare my mind for a future in the Foreign Service. I grew up thinking I would have a career in international service to my country, but I thought it would be in the Olympics. The movies, you know, the only movie I knew about the Foreign Service was Midnight Express. Raise your hand if you've seen Midnight Express. You know, the consular officer is not particularly helpful. I think we need an office in Hollywood. But some of you probably have seen Argo. Again, where were the Foreign Service officers? Waiting to be rescued by Ben Affleck. My senior year, up in Laura Sadovnikov's office, that was my bedroom at the time, is when I heard on the radio about the hostages being taken in Iran. And 444 days later, when I was in the middle of what was then Zaire as a Peace Corps volunteer, I heard on a different radio that they had been freed. But I thought about that. What would I do if I'm taken hostage as a Peace Corps volunteer? Because I knew I wanted to be a Peace Corps volunteer. And I had actually taken a yoga class at Brown, and I thought, well, I could do yoga in a little cell. So I had that kind of in my quiver. And the reason I wanted to be in the Peace Corps was a teacher. The influence of two teachers of mine in high school had been associated with Peace Corps, one as a volunteer and another as a trainer. So kind of in the back of my mind, I thought, well, I'll do that at some point. But what did I do in terms of coursework to prepare for that? Absolutely nothing. I took courses that were of interest to me. The one course I should not have dropped was probably the most pertinent. The politics of East-West trade. I don't even know why I dropped it. I just remember something about the importance of peanuts to the Gambian economy. I should have stuck with it because later we have these evaluations every year. It's like our report card every year. And we always have to have an area for improvement. And one year it was focus more on regional economic integration. So I think I will go into a little bit of these precepts, which are kind of I'll say sort of the check the box, the criteria, not on which you're admitted to the Foreign Service, but on which you're judged once you're in there. And there's a tenuring process where you get an initial 5-year assignment or 5-year appointment, and you get looked at by 2 or 3 different tenuring boards to decide if it's worth having you stick around. Most people do get tenured. It's usually in their second assignment. And these are the criteria. So right now it's actually EER season, Employee Evaluation Report season. So that was on my mind on this airplane ride too. So the 6 precepts that we get graded on are leadership, management, interpersonal skills, communications, substantive knowledge, and intellectual skills. So when I thought about it, I thought, well, actually, there are 4 of these precepts that Brown, the rigorous academic menu that I partook of, helped me with that. So, for example, management. How many of you do something extracurricular besides your coursework? Good. You have to manage your time, so you're already getting a good start on figuring out how to balance your coursework and your extracurriculars. Communications, oral presentations, papers, got that, check. Substantive knowledge, well, to my right, Rod is living proof of how his substantive knowledge acquired at Brown was directly relevant to his experience throughout his career as a Foreign Service officer. Mine, not so much, but skills are transferable, and substantive knowledge was required in each course I took to know what the heck was going on. Intellectual, research, analysis, problem solving, all of those things are what you do without even knowing it while you're here at Brown. My extracurricular activities tended towards sports, and through that I developed leadership as captain of the soccer team and the ice hockey team, and also interpersonal skills, riding 8 hours on a road trip to Cornell, for example, in tight quarters on a bus.
Especially coming back.
We usually got to shower. So these are the other course that I took that, the only course I took at Brown that was satisfactory, non-satisfactory, which I hope still exists, was my French class. It was a French literature class. My French wasn't that good. I kept falling asleep because it was right after lunch. I had a little trouble with the substance, wondered why we were analyzing poems. So that would have been one that could have been a more helpful direct connection with my future career. But when I look at the other types of courses that I took, as a classics major, I took mostly dead languages and literature. And these were very foundational, Greek, Latin, and then the French I mentioned, which has actually come in handy throughout my career. History, art history, religious studies, getting to know other people, other cultures, what makes them tick, what are the drivers of economic and political developments and wars. I also found that a course I took in debate and another course in semantics helped me with communication skills and also messaging and decoding messages. And finally, since really fundamentally diplomacy is about people, I did take a course in interpersonal communications with Dr. Barbara Tannenbaum. I think she's still active duty on the faculty. And one of the books for that course was called Bridges, Not Walls. And that's kind of a great bumper sticker for diplomacy. Brown attracts a lot of amazing speakers, this present company excluded perhaps, but the Dalai Lama was here. I heard the Dalai Lama. And even though I was sitting in the back of the conference area or the hall, he just projected this amazing aura of peace and persistence, and it was made a big impression on me in spite of all of the challenges and the hatred that he and his people were experiencing from a neighbor. So why did I take the Foreign Service exam? I didn't even know it existed while I was at Brown. I took the LSAT. A lot of my friends, those who weren't going to be doctors, were all going to be lawyers, so I kind of went with the flow. Took that, but it was not, something that really spoke to me. Peace Corps was kind of plan B, although it was always operating in background. I thought I could be a Rhodes Scholar. Then I won't have to do anything the rest of my life. I will just tell people I was a Rhodes Scholar. I think they saw through that because I didn't get it, but I applied from Rhode Island because I thought I might have a better crack at it than from New York. I also didn't get the Marshall or the Fulbright. And so these were life skills, dealing with disappointment, formulating and putting in action a plan B that I learned at Brown, after all. I will say, David, was it you that talked about the cocktail parties? So part of the Rhodes process, how many of you thought about applying for a Rhodes Scholarship? Okay, well, go for it, Part of it is a cocktail party. Back in the day, we could drink. 18 was the legal limit, so I don't know what they'll be serving you all if you get that far. And somebody was saying, oh, yes, this wine tastes like the chalk of Dover. And I'm thinking, how could you possibly know that? I didn't say that because I'd taken that interpersonal course. And then there was a panel. There was I can't remember, 4 or 5 people interrogating me. And this was good practice for the oral exam for the State Department later, because that's only 2 people interrogating you. And basically their instructions, as I understand it, are keep asking questions until the person gets uncomfortable and see if they lose their composure. Anyway, one of the first question this panel of 5 asked me was, why are your grades so bad? And so I had to kind of defend myself from the get-go that they really weren't that bad. In Peace Corps is when I finally met some U.S. diplomats, and they encouraged me to think about a career as a diplomat. And I looked at what they did, and I thought, I could do that. So I took the exam, and then I took it again, and then I finally passed. And fundamentally, Rod excluded, I think the Foreign Service exam is an exam of persistence. And this is another quality that is very useful to have in abundance when you are in the Foreign Service. So here I was, no career direction, just taking courses that were interesting, often because I knew there was a good professor. I didn't take one poli-sci course. I didn't take one international relations course. I dropped out of my one economics course. I didn't do junior year abroad because I didn't want to miss a sports season. The anti-apartheid divestment demonstrations were raging on the green right outside my window when I wasn't living in Laura Sadovnikov's office, but in Slater Hall. And maybe it was an issue of bandwidth or absorptive capacity in development speak, or just plain prioritization and time management. But I didn't participate in all that, even though I knew, gee, I'm going to go to Africa as a Peace Corps volunteer someday. Later, when I was a Peace Corps volunteer, my way of protesting was I would not buy any of those crispy green Granny Smith apples that were imported from South Africa. It's my little way of protest. One of the things that Brown didn't prepare me for was the acronyms. I thought, there's a lot of acronyms in the government service. But then as I was on the plane coming here, I thought, well, wait a minute. I bet everyone here knows BDH, BRU, RASP, ECDC. Well, maybe people don't remember ECDC.
Yeah,
I think that's
ECDC,
gone the way of the dodo. TWC, LSAT, GCB. Is the GCB still here? Yeah, but you probably can't go and drink like we did. But anyway.
Grad Center Bar, what was that?
Yeah, the
Yeah.
Graduate Center
Yeah.
bar. So I'm going to wrap up with one story about Richard Holbrooke, who I met once. I ran into him in an elevator when I was director of the State Department Operations Center. This is the State Department's alerting, briefing, communications, and international crisis management hub. You've heard about that 3 a.m. phone call in the political ads. We're the ones who make that phone call. So I introduced myself to Richard Holbrooke in the elevator. This is when he was in his final position as the U.S. Special Representative for Afghanistan and Pakistan. And I said I was the director of the Operations Center. And he looked at me, riveted for a moment, and said, "The voices," and explained that in his book about the Balkans, he had referred to the voices on the other end of the line, the voices of the watch officers who answer in times of crisis. He called them the voices. And then he quickly turned and resumed his other conversation. So I'm really looking forward to seeing the movie later tonight. And with that, I will turn it over to my good friend, Ambassador Stuart Symington.
Richard, so we can get to questions, how much time do we have left?
You got more time.
So you all, first I want to introduce my significant other of about 40 years, Susan Symington. Susan, will you raise your hand? In our business, this is a really important choice. So keep your eyes open as you go around the campus. Second, show of hands. How many people are thinking of perhaps doing something in their careers outside of the state of Rhode Island or the United States? Could I have a show of hands? Great. How many of you are thinking of doing something that makes big money?
This is a very dishonest group.
So I'm going to now give you the best career advice I think we could give the world, and that is leave this room and find someone as a significant other who is.
Yeah, absolutely.
And this is not just a life suggestion for you. This is a life suggestion for every principle and every interest you will ever seek to advance. Because there is a ration in the heart of all policy. It's breakfast, lunch, or dinner sometime in the next 72 hours. There is no politician in the world, no government, no governance that can possibly survive when the public servants are not paid and the people don't have bread. So if you want to change the world, start off, I kid you not, figuring out how to make an honest day's living. And by that I mean ending the day with substantially more than the ration that you will consume. And thinking of that as a good thing. One of my colleagues said that when he was in school, everybody was trying to decide whether to become an investment banker or become a Peace Corps volunteer. Unfortunately for you, there are no investment bankers on this panel. Luckily, the space that we're in is in part supported by some investment bankers. The world is too. One last question. How many of you have thought that the most important thing at Brown was the people that you were here with? How many of you have thought that the most important of those people were your classmates? I hope that you will create, while you're at Brown, the one best thing I did. Turn your teachers into classmates. Here's how you do it. Has anybody taken a lecture class that had more than 100 students in it? Has anybody ever wanted to have, say, 45 minutes to pick the brain of that professor, personally?
Yeah.
Not after you get your exam question back? So here's how you do it. Pick your favorite professor. Also pick 2 or 3 students for top cover. Send your professor a note saying, if you will give us something to read of 10 pages or less, I will read it all, and so will my fellow students. We will buy you coffee. Meet us at whatever you call the place that is most likely to work. And they will come. And you will read it. And you will have the best 45-minute meeting of your career. It will be very much like, by the way, at Swarthmore they call them cocktail parties. At Brown we used to call them something else, keg parties. But you will have the best 45 minutes of your career. And then repeat. I started 2 groups at Brown undercover, dealing with a bunch of different folks, and we did a lunch, a brown bag lunch, and coffee and donuts, and they were wonderful. And that's exactly what diplomacy is. It's turning the world into your mentor, your student, and your classmate. One interaction at a time. It's, don't tell David I said this, but it's changing that awful Eastern European acronym KSA into ASK, starting with attitude, and then thinking skills, and then thinking knowledge. It's ask and listen. Well, we don't have a lot of time, but I would say this. We're going to break out later, and I will take all those interested in the old continent, as we call it, Africa. And I'm looking forward to talking to you about those things. I would love to, though, be a resource for anybody in this room on any other subject. A couple of quick lessons at Brown. Number one, it's great to do your junior year abroad, because you might actually learn a language when someone here who gave you a placement test, not in Russian but in French, said, never study a foreign language. You have a learning disability if you've sat in a class for 6 years and learned as little French as you've learned. So I went to Paris, was an auditor at Sciences Po, came back, talked to that guy. He gave me a couple years of college credit, which gave me credit for my junior year abroad. So number one is do what looks like fun regardless of who tells you what you can do. Second rule is, if you study Russian, be good at it. If after the first semester in our wonderful system, you're about to get your grade and you have not yet memorized the Cyrillic alphabet, drop it like a hot stone, like I did. And it will not show up on your transcript. Or else I wouldn't have been here, because these guys did really well. And we've got enough Russian speakers on the panel and in this institute, I might add. The last thought is, if you speak French, just as if you speak Russian, you will not go to a French or Russian-speaking country when you join the Foreign Service. Right. You will go to Mexico or Honduras. Yeah. And that's great, because you'll have an opportunity to learn how to speak Spanish, which helped me a lot with the meter maid, who is a lady named Maria from the Dominican Republic, who said I could leave my car in the 2-hour place after we talked a little bit about her background. You guys, one life lesson, though. The single best message I ever got in my life, I got in a seedy bar outside of Lagos in the year 2003 from a retired Major General in the Nigerian Army who is now a human rights worker. And he said, Stu, if you were the president of Nigeria, who would you love to see come into your office? And I said, the oil and gas companies. And he said, right you are. Why? Anybody know the answer? It goes back to my first point. Absolutely. It's like robbing banks. That's where the money is. And then he said, who would you hate to see come into your office? Guess what the answer is?
The human rights guy.
That guy, one of many. But who are the rest of the guys you'd hate to show up in your office?
Good one.
Another member of that large category. Human rights guys, auditor, who are they?
Good one.
Who would you hate to see? I'll give you a hint. You got,
The logical conclusion is people who are asking for money.
talk to me before you go take that cocktail party. Right, the answer is, you would hate to see the people of Nigeria. And why? Because they're gonna ask you for the money you got from the other guys. And then he looked at me like a complete idiot, and he said, so Stu, what kind of democracy can you have when the people depend on the government instead of the government depending on the people? That's the single greatest lesson I learned, and I learned it in a seedy bar outside Lagos years after I left Brown. But I never would have gotten to that bar had I not spoken French, because I took Professor Gleason's class, and I figured I could study Russian economic history, if not the Russian language. I dreamed up at the last minute, when I returned from my junior year, one of these marvelous Brown single concentrations, which was expansionism. America's moved west, and Russia's moved east, compared. I took every course that I'd gotten an A in, which included anthropology. I might have done reasonably well in Russian economic history, but I don't think I aced it. And a couple of others. I cobbled it together, economic history, didn't put down Russian language. And that was my Brown experience. I passed, I took a course, I took the LSAT, became a lawyer, went to Europe because I spoke French, having been told not to study foreign languages, worked in London and Paris for a couple years, met American diplomats, and said, this is great. I've been practicing Mickey Mouse law, literally, because I protected the copyrights of the Walt Disney Corporation in Mickey and Minnie as a junior lawyer. Now I get to be an advocate for our country. This is a good gig, and I heard the same speech you did. The DCM, who was a family friend and the #2 guy at our embassy in London, said, Stu, what are you making? I was a third-year lawyer. And he said, Stu, you're making as much as a third-year lawyer as I am after 35 years as a diplomat. Never become a diplomat. So as this, like, never learn French, never become a diplomat, I immediately came home, talked to Susan, and she said, let's send in the application, took the exam, and here I am. One last point, but by the way, you guys, my email, my perpetual email is WS, another S, Symington, WSSYMING2N @hotmail.com. My government email is symingtonws@hotmail.com. I'm available, as Susan would say, for an excruciatingly long set of consults on any topic. But I would just tell you one last thing, and that is that every single day as a diplomat, you will use the most important skills that you've learned at Brown, which is that the notion that people matter isn't just a phrase. The heart of the conflict in the world is a chronic lack of citizenship. And the Nigerians' general's answer to the question, how do you make Nigeria work, was put the people of Nigeria back to work. Let Nigeria again become, like the Ukraine, a place where grain is grown, where rations are produced, where people pay taxes. And a day after that happens, the leaders of Nigeria will care for every citizen, because that citizen will be a productive unit, changing the face of Nigeria, not just a voter you need once every few years. It's the greatest lesson I've ever learned, and I share that with you, and I got a couple others, including it's amazing what you can do if you don't steal the money, and that from a Quechua Indian in Ecuador, and my other personal favorite, which is the most important thing in Rwanda is security. What about education, health, jobs, etc.? Stuart, what do you think security is? So with that, I'll let you go, but I'm looking forward to all of you pressing the envelope and seeing how, as diplomats, you can do what we seek to do in the world, which is let the other guy have it our way.
I want to thank all our panel. We've got about a half hour, 45 minutes for questions. I was going to ask the first one, but there's one before me, so go.
Thank you. I can interrupt. Thank you so much for taking the time to come and speak with us. It's really important to hear your thoughts. I'm an international relations honors student. I'm a senior. I'm going to be presenting a thesis on political economy and global arts for social change tomorrow afternoon. And I just submitted my application for the public diplomacy track of the Foreign Service. And so this is an incredibly wonderful panel to be seeing. So in my examination and pursuit of a career in the Foreign Service, I encountered the opinion that perhaps I shouldn't join the Foreign Service because I am a woman. This is the question for Ambassador Sullivan. I'm wondering if you have encountered this opinion, and I'm wondering how you responded.
Never came up.
Never came up, not once. The rest of the panelists, have you ever encountered this opinion from, not that, as men, have you ever encountered this opinion? Have you ever witnessed this opinion being given to a colleague? How would you respond hypothetically in this situation?
Well, I have one thing to say, which is not a direct answer to the question, but one thing to think about when you think about the Foreign Service is that you're not just choosing a job, you're choosing a lifestyle. And so, you know, that impact on your personal life and on your family and so forth is huge. And so that is something you definitely need to think about. And
Which would be true, of course, whether you're a guy or a girl.
Exactly. And so one of the challenges facing the State Department is retention of people because of spousal employment. So this affects, again, both genders for sure, because people coming into the State Department often have partners who are very well educated and very ambitious and want to develop their own career, and it's not easy to do that following a Foreign Service officer. So that's not, you know, directly to that question, but it's an issue that you do need to think about for sure.
So,
Can I take the floor, Rick?
oh,
My very first boss in the Foreign Service had to leave the Foreign Service when she got married.
is that Phyllis?
No, it was Kay Clark Bourne. They had to pry her away from her desk. She was serving in then Bombay, India. Apparently she married the heir to the singer Fortune. After a few years, she decided she would really rather be a Foreign Service officer again than be married. So legend has it she introduced him to someone at a cocktail party. Resulted in a divorce, and she was back at work. But, I mean, there've been a number of lawsuits. There've been lawsuits, African-American lawsuits, female lawsuits. For me, I don't know, I mean, I was here at Brown at the dawn of Title IX. We were fighting to get the resources for our athletic programs. It wasn't that long beforehand that Pembroke had become part of Brown. Maybe I just never noticed. I mean, you just get used to it in a way, but nobody ever said, oh, you can't do that job because you're a woman. And in fact, on the way here, I was listening to a report on NPR of a book about women special forces operators in Afghanistan, and how, oh, guess what? These women who were trained in special ops, they can go check under that woman's burqa and find that weapon people are looking for. They can go check that baby's soiled diaper and find the contraband. They can go and schmooze with the women while, in a way that the men special operators can't do. And there was so much brouhaha over whether women could have combat roles. So I often find I'm the only woman at a meeting in Brazzaville. And I'm constantly saying, where are the women? Where are the women? And there's a lot of harassment. People, a lot of the women, the Congolese women, they just don't want to put up with it. As a foreigner, you're kind of in a different category, though. They don't quite know what to make of you, and you can do your cross-cultural stuff, but you don't have to follow all the rules exactly. So you get a little bit of a pass. And just parachuting into that situation would have been hard, but having been a Peace Corps volunteer only 50 miles away from Brazzaville in another country on the other side of the river, I feel comfortable, I know the lay of the land, and humor goes a long way. But I never felt like I should not have a career in the Foreign Service because I'm a woman.
I'd add one last thing to that, which is that until Secretary Kerry got the job, there were an awful lot of guys that wondered whether or not the State Department hire ranks were only for women. Having had a bunch of female secretaries. I also think the State Department has more women in senior positions than any other agency of the United States government. I haven't done the math, but I'd love for you to Google it. And I also think that as we try to model things to the world, there's not a better way of doing it than that. Almost all the people who have advanced my career, in addition to Susan, have been women, including the lady for whom I now work, who's the Assistant Secretary of African Affairs.
Yeah, if you look at right now, you have a deputy secretary, several undersecretaries who are women, and so, I guess I didn't understand what was the rationale of this person who warned you about this. What were they suggesting you would encounter as a woman?
A few points were raised. I'd be happy to talk more about it with you
Separately.
after
Okay.
the panel.
Okay, well, let's keep going with questions from the audience. I'm not gonna shut them down.
You have all in various ways made the case for the value of foreign language, that is a language other than English. It's not clear whether some languages other than English are more valuable in the eyes of the State Department than others. For example, if the choice is between Polish and Bulgarian, would that make a difference? So as students choose which language and how many languages, what would enhance their attractiveness to the Foreign Service? The unusual language, multiple languages, universal languages?
You want to start, Victoria?
I'm the diplomat in residence for New England. I hope that some of you were here when I was presenting 3 days after the killer snowstorm on a snowy night with a lot of big piles of snow outside. The Foreign Service actually, you can come into the Foreign Service without any foreign language whatsoever, and we will teach you one because you must demonstrate competency in a foreign language by the time you are tenured within those first 2 tours. However, if you already have a language, then you receive an advantage in the process of coming in. Specifically at the level of the oral exam, your passing is a score of 5.25, a scale up to 7. If you can get the equivalent of minimal professional competency, a 3 on a scale of 5, in the Russians and Frenches and Spanishes of this world, you get 0.17 points added to your score. If you can do the critical languages, which is no longer Russian, but it is Korean, Japanese, Chinese, Arabic, Pashto, Urdu, I can never name all 9 of them at once, but anyway, those languages, then at a 2-2 level, minimal ability to converse socially, you get 0.25 points and you get 0.33 points for professional competency in those harder languages. So that's a big space between the room between 5.25 and 7, and could very much make the difference between being offered a job and falling off of the register. But again, if you just naturally do really well in the oral exam, we will teach you anything. I had a young woman who came to Bamako with French. She learned Italian to go to her second tour in Rome. She wanted to be a one-person public diplomacy section, so she learned Mongolian to go to Ulaanbaatar. And she just finished studying Portuguese and arrived in Mozambique last Monday. I have another friend who studied Laotian, Cambodian, French, and Haitian Creole in the Foreign Service.
If I could just add one thing, when I was here at Brown and I was thinking about the State Department, Strobe Talbot came to speak when he was Deputy Secretary, and I asked him almost the same question. I said, I'm thinking about joining the State Department. What regions should I really concentrate on? Obviously, I already had a background in Russia, but I was thinking, it might be interesting to get into some other language, some other region. And he gave me a great answer, which was, do what you love. Because that is what
Absolutely.
that is what is going to naturally drive you and motivate you to achieve and ultimately keep you asking more and more questions, not only about the language, but about the culture. And that drive for more and more knowledge is what makes us good Foreign Service officers. So that's, I think, my answer to that question is choose things that you really are interested in.
Okay. Everyone back there?
Hi there. My name is Sarah. I'm actually a grad student in anthropology, and I am curious about your role as a representative for the United States government when United States government policy or representation may be in conflict with your own personal opinions, and how do you negotiate that?
So a quick one, you guys. As a lawyer, the greatest challenge you face is that you're always protecting Mickey and Minnie and Porsche and Motion Picture Export Association and Westinghouse, if you have my old firm's client list, and Ford Motor Company, regardless of whether or not you think on one issue or not they're right. They remain your client. And so you could ask yourself the same question. When it's our country, the core principles are our country's principles. Policy is like variations, musical variations on a theme. When I came into the Foreign Service in 1986, in January, our goals in the world were development, democracy, and anti-drug and security. That was Honduras. Now, 30 years later, they're the same. So the first news is it's not our country right or wrong. It's our country moving it to the right. So for example, if you're an ambassador and you're given an instruction to go in and do something that you believe personally to be absolutely wrong, you still do it because you're an ambassador, you're not a freelancer. But you don't do it until you try to make it as right as it can possibly be. And when you do it, you try to do as little harm as you possibly can. So for example, if I'm asked at a party to influence your position on a certain thing, and I've got 5 things that I want to influence your position on, and I believe absolutely that 4 are critical to our country, and I'm thinking in the back of my mind, let the other guy have it our way, I will probably spend more of my time trying to persuade you on the one thing that I think is most important and most in our interest than on that other hardest thing. But you gotta deliver the message. And when the White House says, you're going out, will you represent policies that you disagree with? And you answer the question, no, then you will not go out as an ambassador. And you shouldn't go out as a diplomat. But you should fight like crazy to make it as good as you can possibly make it. Now, if you're ever asked to do anything illegally, the answer is, yeah, could you repeat that again? That's a different matter. I don't know, other thoughts, you guys?
Let me just add something. I mean, I couldn't agree more with what you said. Has it happened to me? Many times. And many times when I've been uncomfortable with the instructions from Washington or overall approach. But fundamentally, I don't have a problem with that because no one elected me. We have a democratic system. The President of the United States is elected by the people of the United States to carry out foreign policy of the United States. And I work on his or her behalf, it's always been his, whoever that president is. So I feel ultimately that I have an obligation to carry out basically the democratic will of the United States as expressed through elections. That said, you can do things to try to modify that policy. You can go back either phone calls, emails, cables, or we even have something called a dissent channel process in which you can strongly present your views to try to encourage Washington to see things a different way. And at the end of the day, you know, the nuclear weapon you have is you can resign if you don't, if you feel so strongly about an issue. But philosophically, I don't have an issue with this. Even sometimes I've cringed because I really haven't supported what we've had to do. But part of the job, as I say.
And until I moved to Colorado, nobody had ever said, be in favor of drugs. I went to Colorado last time. No one has ever said, don't be in favor of democracy. No one has ever said, don't be in favor of development. No one has ever said, don't be in favor of good governance. So on the things that don't be in favor of people, so on the things that we absolutely, truly care the most about, your government has been remarkably consistent. And every time we rewrite what it is our priorities are, I'm thinking about the instructions that we had in 1986 in Honduras.
I would like to follow up a bit on the language question. So you've given us some of the numbers here, right? But I would like to hear from you about your experiences. How much do you have to know of a language so that it's useful? What levels of a language are usually useful? And if you could speak a little bit to that would be great.
So I don't work in the School of Language Studies at the Foreign Service Institute, but I work at the Foreign Service Institute, so I know a little bit about how the language school works. And generally, our jobs overseas come with a certain language designation, or without one. Some of the jobs are not language designated. And so the system has come up with a ranking of how much language ability you need to be effective in a given position. So 3.3 is this medium sort of basic professional competence level, which we usually require for people who might need to use the language. It's not always a 3.3, but, and that depends on the language, how long it takes to get there. It also depends on the student. But for most languages, that's about a year of study. And some of the easier languages, about a half a year. And so we have these numbers associated with given positions, and so you have to make that grade to go fill that position. That being said, you know, every student is different, and some students are incredibly motivated, and they work really hard, not only while they're at FSI learning the language, but once they get to post, to keep up their study. They have a tutor. Embassies will usually provide language tutors if you're interested, and so you can keep working on your language skills, and that ultimately will, of course, improve your effectiveness. And that really kind of depends on the specific job that you're in and exactly what it is you're asked to do. But as a general rule, the FSI will train you to the level that you need for the position, which has been determined over the years about what that position requires.
Let me add something to that, having taken many languages through the State Department. I think it's wonderful. It's wonderful in so many different ways. First of all, that you're paid to study language. It's, if you like studying language, some people find it torture, but if you like studying language, it's phenomenal to actually be paid to learn a language. And we do this better than most diplomatic services in the world, especially when we go to countries with obscure languages. Frequently, the American diplomats, maybe some of the Chinese diplomats are good at it as well, will be the only ones who can communicate with the local leaders and local public in the local language, and it gives you a big leg up, I find. The different levels of language, 3.3, except in the particularly hard language, is generally the minimum competency level, as David said. But if you want to be able to operate, let's say give a television interview or a speech or so forth, you probably are going to want to be at a little higher level than that. And again, that adds to your effectiveness as a diplomat.
Okay, one more question and then we'll break up. Okay, quick question.
Add to what you just said, how important is culture, music, history, all the other things other than just how to speak the language in the State Department's understanding of your competence?
I don't want to dominate. I certainly have a view on that, but let someone else answer that.
Wait, in the State Department's
No.
understanding of your competence, not in the local host
Students
country's
get this or don't
assessment.
get this on their own,
Yeah.
but is it an advantage for the State Department to be really well-versed in the culture of the area, or just the language?
Language is culture, and
Not
yes,
always.
the food, the dress, the
But he
music.
means on the test.
You're talking about the test, or
No, no,
just
no.
when you're out in the
just
field?
the career.
Oh,
Well, ultimately, anything that makes you more effective is going to be rewarded. If you only speak the language but have no context, it's very wooden. You know, you'll get some points on it, but you're not going to get. I mean, I am fortunate to be in Congo-Brazzaville, where one of the main local languages is Lingala. I learned to speak Lingala as a Peace Corps volunteer 30 years ago. I kept it up by listening to Congolese music for 30 years, just because I like, do what you love. I love to listen to Congolese music. My interest in Congolese culture it's hard to fake, and it's really opened a lot of doors. So I would say a resounding yes, if that's a yes/no question.
I'd say, yes, it's really important. No, they don't teach it to you. I came out of Chinese. I could talk about Sino-Soviet conflict. I could talk about balance of payments, but I couldn't watch a soap opera. Learn how to learn the rest of life, kind of on your own, or in Peace Corps. All right, we're going to break up.
If I may, I feel the need to say 3 words, which are careers.state.gov.
Okay. We're going to break up. Each of these people is available in a space that Sue's going to tell us about, and you can talk to them about regional stuff, but you can basically keep asking them any kind of question you feel.
Okay, before we break up, I wanted to say a couple things. First of all, I wanted to introduce Ambassador Mary Beth Leonard. who is in the diplomat in residence in New England. She has been here. She is available to us. She's been a tremendous resource in talking about the kind of opportunities. For example, if you're graduating and you don't have a job, there's always things called virtual internships in which you can do research for the State Department, unpaid, but a good thing to do. And then we also have, and you should, all of you Brown students should know this, Ambassador William Twiddell, who is former ambassador to Nigeria, who is here in Providence, and is someone that we have the ability to take advantage of on a day in and day out basis. So I want you to know that. I also want to.
Sue, let me just jump in and say, for Bill, he's got an organization that helps place refugees in the United States. So if anybody's asking themselves how you can make a difference one person at a time, I urge you to also think about maybe talking to my mentor and former colleague, Bill Twiddell, about that.
Just in Rhode Island, that's where we focus.
That's right.
International Institute.
It's a big state, though, as we now know.
But this is, we are ending this portion, this is not an end of the afternoon, and this is your opportunity as Brown students to get together in smaller groups, to talk to them about some of the substantive challenges on the issues they deal with, and also continue the dialogue about their careers and the kind of things, advice that they might be able to give you. So we're gonna break up into 4 sessions. We are going to, Ambassador Symington is going to go up to the library. Ambassador Sullivan is going to go up to McKinney. The library is at this end. McKinney's on the 3rd floor over here. David Gehrenbeck is going to go to the South Commons room on the 2nd floor down here. And Ambassador Moore is going to go to the North Commons room. Again, this is your opportunity. We have students who have volunteered to help facilitate the discussion. But this is your opportunity, so I urge you to take advantage of it. Following this session, then at 4 o'clock, there'll be a general reception in the lobby for everyone to continue the dialogue, and then take a break, and then at 5:30, as Rick Locke mentioned, there is the screening of the film The Diplomat about Richard Holbrooke's life. It will be a panel discussion also with his son, and then David Rode, who is a Brown alumni, and whom Richard Holbrooke negotiated, I think, his release twice. I think he was a journalist. And so there'll be a discussion there that President Paxson will be at. So we've had a very full day, and since we won't be in plenary again, I just wanted to thank all of our alumni for coming back. I want to thank Richard Boucher, so please join me in giving them a warm applause. So grab some brownies or drink or something, and to the breakout rooms.